we'll look at and explore the external or lateral rotation that can happen around the trail shoulder and really how that sits and fits alongside the lead arm horizontal AB or adduction. So in this case, the lead arm adduction in transition. So lead arm adduction is attracted, and rightly so for many reasons, much discussion and attention in recent times around really its role and the contribution it makes in really increasing clubhead speed and really helping produce that wonderfully elastic movement that we have in transition. However, proportionately and as a contributor to that very elastic movement that we have, the amount of external rotation the trail shoulder moves through is actually a much bigger and more dominant influence on our ability, or one's ability, to produce clubhead speed. So we have two real-time values on display here. The top one is the lead shoulder AB adduction, so ab adduction, and the bottom one is the trail shoulder internal external rotation. So just looking at those kind of reference values at address, we have a lead arm which is 25 degrees adducted and a trail shoulder which sits essentially 15 degrees into internal rotation relative to the rib cage. So for definition of this tutorial, how I define, or how the Bull3D system defines internal external rotation, it essentially is the internal external rotation of the humerus relative to the rib cage, or really how much actual rotation has happened around that joint relative to the rotation and orientation of the rib cage as it moves through space. So in essence, it's actually the true definition of external rotation within the golf swing, because it's relative to essentially how much the rib cage is rotating, rather than the independent view of just orthopedically how much is that shoulder moves in independent of the rib cage. So we move this player through backswing. What's actually of very high relevance and of great significance is look at really the minimal change in that internal external rotation value around that trail shoulder and backswing. So certainly in very healthy movers and some of the wonderful thoracic and ribcage range, wonderful range around the cervical spine, some beautiful rotational movement through the neck, through the ribcage, into that lumbar spine, then hip joint and ankle. So just a wonderfully rotated mover. Equally so, someone with great and fantastic scapular and shoulder control typically is not unusual, as you'll see here, for actually someone to have minimal actual external or internal rotation around that shoulder joint. So almost using point data now for the purpose of this part of the tutorial, we go to the address value. You'll see a value of, we'll call it 15 degrees internal for ease of discussion. We go immediately to top of backswing. In essence, there's actual no change or no real evident increase or reduction in the humerus position, which is the long bone in the upper arm, relative to the ribcage rotation through backswing. However, equally, if we revert back to the start position and look at the amount of adduction we see displayed in the lead arm at address, and then go to top of backswing, a very evident increase of 16 degrees of adduction or movement across the ribcage of that lead arm through backswing. However, if we then start to explore then the activity, and really in many ways this is actually the truest definition of what some know as the X factor stretch in transition. So in separate tutorials and within the anatomy page over time, we'll start to really look at more anatomically, really where through the spine and where through the system do we actually produce the concept of X factor or pelvis thorax separation and movement, but from a very precise anatomical discussion really of what part of the system and really to what scale or what value do those segments and areas then actually start to produce that separation, rather than the very global crude definition of really the numerical difference between the pelvis and rib cage in transition. It's a lot more precise and much more involved than that we actually look at where through the system is the actual separation happening and what contribution do those joints make to what we know as the X factor stretch. Ironically, just for this very light part of this tutorial, it really happens above essentially T8 or the 8th rib or the 8th thoracic vertebrae or the diaphragm. So it's really separation above the diaphragm or separation in the upper spine, rather than the kind of global definition of pelvis rib cage. So actual true X factor or true X factor stretch is really what happens above the 8th rib or the 8th vertebrae or the diaphragm. So it really is separation of the rib cage rather than rib cage pelvis separation. So really the activity we see around that trail shoulder in transition is actually a much better reflector and representation of really how elastic and one's ability to